Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so picture this. It's the 1950s, and you're a black American trying to escape the Jim Crow South. Where do you go?
The North.
Right, exactly. The North. It's the promised land, opportunity, a fresh start. But what if I told you that it wasn't that simple?
It wasn't. The North had its own brand of racism. Less overt, maybe, but just as powerful.
And that's what we're diving into today, unpacking this myth of the promised land.
We're talking about the Great Migration, right?
6 million black Americans moving north, seeking a better life. 6 million.
Between 1916 and 1970, imagine the impact, the pressure on housing, jobs, resources. It reshaped cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia.
Those photos, though, those crowded black neighborhoods in northern cities, they tell a different story.
And those were often the result of deliberate segregation, not just happenstance.
Hold on. Deliberately. How? Weren't there supposed to be no Jim Crow laws in the North?
It's about systems. It's landlords refusing to rent, real estate agents steering black families to certain areas, and then there's redlining.
Redlining.
Banks would literally draw red lines on maps around neighborhoods they considered risky for investment.
Let me guess. Where black families lived.
You got it. And these areas were starved of resources, loans, mortgages, even basic services, trapping families in poverty.
So you couldn't buy a house in a better neighborhood even if you had the money?
The system wouldn't let you. Even the federal government was in on it. The Federal Housing Administration often denied mortgages based on these redlining maps.
Wow. Discrimination at every level. You escape the South, but the system up north is designed to hold you back. Historian
Thomas Shugru calls it a shift in the battleground. The Great Migration didn't change the racial hierarchy, just where it played out.
No whites-only signs, but the message was clear. Opportunity had its limits. It makes you wonder, what about those booming northern factories? Did black workers at least find economic promise there?
Those factories were a huge draw, absolutely. But for many black workers, it wasn't as simple as just getting a job.
What do you mean? What were they up against?
Imagine you've escaped the South, you've got skills, you're ready to work, right?
Right.
But you're stuck with the worst jobs, the lowest pay, the least security. It was a harsh reality.
They were being paid less for the same work as white workers.
Often, yes. Sometimes 50% less. Imagine that. Working just as hard, but trapped in a cycle of poverty because of your race.
It's hard to hear, you know? They had skills, resilience.
Yeah.
They deserved better.
They did. And it wasn't just individual prejudice. The system itself was rigged against them, even labor unions, which should have been a source of support.
Right, fighting for all workers.
In theory, yes. But black workers often faced huge barriers to entry, limited membership, almost no representation in leadership.
So you leave one bad situation for another. You finally get a decent job, but the union's supposed to protect you as part of the problem.
Exactly. A prime example is the United Auto Workers in Detroit. They were powerful, essential to the auto industry.
Right, I've heard of them.
But black workers were often shut out of the best jobs, the apprenticeships, given the most dangerous work.
It's like even in a space that's supposed to be about equality, they were still fighting an uphill battle.
And historian Robert Ziegler, he argues that while unions did good overall, they failed to address the specific racism black workers faced.
Traded one form of oppression for another, escaped the South, but the discrimination in the North was just less obvious, right?
It's a tragic irony. And it shows that the fight for racial justice, it's about more than just laws. It's about changing hearts and minds, changing the entire system.
It makes you realize that progress is slow, and even places that seem progressive can have hidden biases.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about jobs and housing. There was a very real threat of violence for black communities in the North.
Wait, really? They face violence even in the North? Riots, intimidation? I thought we were talking about the Promised Land.
It's a part of the story that's often overlooked, but it's essential to understanding the full picture.
So give me an example. What kind of violence are we talking about?
One case that stands out is Herman Lee in Cicero, Illinois, 1949. Black war veteran, just bought a house.
Sounds like the American dream, right? Served his country, worked hard.
But this was Cicero, a mostly white suburb. Lee buying a house there, seen as a threat.
A threat because he was black.
A riot broke out. 4,000 people.
4,000 people.
Attacking his home, throwing rocks, breaking windows, setting fires. It took the National Guard to stop it.
This is the North. You'd think, you'd hope, people would be more accepting. It really shatters that image of the North as a haven, doesn't it?
It does, and it wasn't an isolated incident. Violence, from riots to intimidation, was a constant threat for Black families trying to build a life in the North.
It's just heartbreaking, you know? They went north for safety, for opportunity, and still faced this kind of hate. Where was the promise in that promised land?
It shows you how deep prejudice runs, doesn't it? It's not always about signs and laws. It can be baked into the very fabric of a society.
In those restrictive covenants we talked about earlier, those played a role too, right? Keeping Black families trapped in certain neighborhoods.
Absolutely. Imagine this. You finally save up enough to buy a house, right? A chance to get out of a cramped, red-lined neighborhood. But you hit a wall, literally a legal one. Racial covenants.
Those clauses in the deeds that said Black families couldn't own property there.
Exactly.
Didn't the Supreme Court rule those illegal eventually?
They did. 1948, Shelley v. Kramer. Big victory, but
There's always a but.
the damage was done. Those covenants had been in place for decades. They'd choked off Black homeownership, wealth building. Even after they were illegal, many neighborhoods stayed segregated.
So the legal win didn't erase the real-life consequences. It makes you wonder, was there any kind of pushback beyond the courts? Was there a northern version of the civil rights movement we hear about in the South?
Absolutely. While the South was fighting Jim Crow, the North had its own fight going on. Groups like the NAACP, CORE, they were on the front lines,
What were they doing specifically?
organizing protests, suing for fair housing, demanding better jobs, calling out police brutality. They knew the North wasn't a utopia. Racism just looked different up there.
It's like that saying, same game, different uniform. So were there any big moments, pivotal events in the North during this time? People we should know about?
One that stands out is the Chicago Freedom Movement, 1966, led by Dr. King himself.
Dr. King went to Chicago. Wow, I never really learned about that.
It shows you this wasn't just a Southern problem. Dr. King saw the housing issues, the economic inequality, the police violence in Chicago, and he knew it was all connected to a bigger national problem.
Did the movement have an impact?
It's complicated. It brought a lot of attention to what was happening in Chicago, but it didn't lead to the kind of huge systemic changes Dr. King was hoping for, at least not right away.
What got in the way?
Well, historian Thomas Segru, he argues that the economy, the political machines, the deeply ingrained discrimination, they were all much tougher to change than people expected. It's a reminder that real equality takes more than just changing laws. It takes changing the whole way things work.
We've covered a lot today, and I think it's pretty clear. The North in the 1950s, it wasn't the promised land. It was a battleground. Black Americans fought hard for equality there, just like in the South.
Absolutely. And we can't forget that fight. It's a crucial part of American history, even if it doesn't get as much attention as the fight in the South.
The sheer scale of the Great Migration is mind-blowing. Millions of people on the move, all hoping for something better. It's hard to grasp what that must have been like, the collective experience of all those journeys.
It was a defining chapter in American history, that's for sure. Isabel Wilkerson, in her book, The Warmth of Other Suns, she describes it as a mass movement, not just for opportunity, but for survival.
And didn't she also talk about how the Great Migration exposed the hypocrisy of the American dream? Like, the North wasn't as open and welcoming as they claimed to be.
You hit the nail on the head. The Great Migration showed that the North had its own deep-seated prejudices, even if they weren't always as obvious as in the South.
It's a good reminder that progress isn't always a straight line, is it? Even when we take a step forward, we can't let our guard down. The fight for equality never really ends.
You said it. And as we've seen today, understanding the past, understanding how discrimination works, it's essential if we want to create a better future.
So where do we go from here? What can we learn from the struggles of Black Americans in the North during this time? What can we do with this knowledge?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Those struggles, the housing discrimination, the economic inequality, the violence, they still have an impact today.
It really makes you think. What if we put as much effort into dismantling systemic racism as we did into creating it? What if we saw equality as something we all have to work towards, not a burden?
Those are the kind of questions I hope our listeners will keep asking themselves long after this episode is over. Because the truth is, until we confront the mistakes of the past, we're doomed to repeat them.
And those are conversations we can't afford to ignore any longer. Thanks for being here today, for taking this deep dive with us. It's been eye-opening, honestly, and I hope our listeners feel the same way.
It's been a pleasure, as always. And to our listeners, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better tomorrow.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.